Hello, and welcome to This Week in X, presented by Crushing Comics. I'm your host, Peter, and I'm here to give you something that's not just a review, not just a recap, not just a reaction, but I like to think of it as context. I'm trying to give you an idea of where all of Marvel's X-Men comics stand, and if you should be reading them, and if you want to be reading them, what you'd need to catch up on to get to the present day. So we're covering all of the comic books out this past Wednesday on September 5th, and there are 4 up this week. Astonishing X-Men, Old Man Logan, Weapon X, and X-Men Gold. So let's get right down to it. Our first X book of the week is Astonishing X-Men issue number 15. Astonishing X-Men number 15 was written by Matthew Rosenberg, with pencilers Greg Land and Neil Edwards, inker Jay Leistine, colors from Frank D'Armata, letters from Clayton Cowell, and a cover from Greg Land with Frank D'Armata. It was edited by Annalise Bisa, Darren Shan, and X-Men group editor Jordan White. Let me set up for you where we stand in Astonishing X-Men right now. Astonishing X-Men 1 through 12 were a Charles Soule story, sort of a mega arc, that helped bring some X-Men together, but we haven't seen play recently, and also put a form of Professor Xavier back on the board. Now we have started a new arc of Astonishing X-Men, beginning with issue 13 by Matthew Rosenberg. And this, I would say, is very much the return of Havoc. Now, Havoc recently well, more than just recently, he's been Axis flipped since the Axis event that happened before Secret Wars. And that meant he was rather villainous, and there were only a few characters after the end of that event who were left in their flipped states, and Havoc was one of them. Sabretooth, who we're going to get to a little bit later, was another one. So he's been in that kind of semi-villain mode. We saw him collaborating, I think, as part of Secret Empire, but then we had an arc with him very recently in the 20s of X-Men Blue, where he was part of these kind of bad mutants, and he was allied with Emma Frost. And each one of those bad mutants kind of got taken out in their own way. And the way Havoc got taken out was his Axis was finally flipped back to normal. So this Astonishing X-Men arc, beginning on 13, 3 issues past now, or 2 issues ago, is the process of seeing what he's getting back to with his life. Now, Havoc's not the only cast member here. We have a few others whose status quo you might want to know. Colossus, who we recently saw had a little bit of an unhappy heartbreak in X-Men Gold, number 30, is here. Dazzler, who has not appeared too much since IVX, although she did have a one-shot, which is not totally acknowledged here. So all you have to know is that she had been doing some superheroing with A-Force, but then she's kind of been trying to do the band thing, but maybe secretly wants to be an X-Men again. And then also Warpath, who was just a part of Weapon X, but very recently parted ways with the Weapon X team, and it seems like this would fit directly after the close of that last Weapon X arc. And we also have Beast, who's just been a lab rat. We haven't seen too many adventures of him lately. And Banshee, who Beast has brought back from his like semi-catatonic state that he's been in ever since he was used as a horseman of the apocalypse after Uncanny Avengers, the middle arc of Uncanny Avengers by Rick Remender that started back in 2013. So where do we stand right now? Well, I would say that this book features happy-go-lucky Havoc. He's a very kind of much more lighthearted, almost silly version of this Havoc character that we've known to be relatively straight-laced, although he can sometimes be funny under pressure. And we've seen this for a lot of years. You know, first when he was in the shadow of Cyclops, when he his whole life really, but when he joined the X-Men full-time in the 210s and then stayed with the team through Inferno and then ultimately leaves in the Siege Perilous period, and then his leadership of X-Factor, and then ultimately returning after Mutant X to Uncanny X-Men, being part of the Shi'ar, Rise and Fall of the Shi'ar Empire in space. Havoc's been through a lot, and he's usually this tough kind of general character, not like general as in specific, but general as in a general. He's a commander, he's a leader. And this is a little bit more of a sillier Havoc, and I have to admit that I'm having a little bit of trouble with that tone. We know that Matt Rosenberg can do serious X-Men. We saw it in Phoenix Resurrection, which was not that funny, and we know he can do very acerbic X-Men, which we just recently saw wrap up on New Mutants Dead Souls, and this Havoc, it's somewhere more towards acerbic. So I'm having a little bit of trouble with that because this is not a cast that I necessarily think would be cracking wise the whole time, although certainly Dazzler tends to be very acerbic. Beast has his very catty moments, if you will excuse my pun. So Havoc basically goes to Kitty Pryde and he's like, I want to get back in the band, I want to be back in the team, and this is in issue 13, and Kitty Pryde's like, So Havoc is trying to assemble his own team of X-Men, although Kitty Pryde has Warpath on his tail, and Warpath is there partly to remind him, you are not the X-Men, this is not an official team. But Havoc is still gathering these members together for his non-X-Men team to do something that he's not entirely forthcoming about. Now, in addition to Havoc's own mystery, we have the team being chased by some sort of government squad, although maybe they're Reavers, maybe they're government squad and Reavers, and that's where this issue picks up. Basically, they've left behind this much publicized assault by the government that they fought back against, so, you know, mutants being cast in a bad light, and they're kind of in a diner just being like, what are we going to do? That's the A story here. And then the B story is, and that A story is illustrated by Greg Land. And then the B story is following the Reavers subplot and also some of the governmental stuff. And that is drawn by Neil Edwards. And those two collide later in the issue, and Neil Edwards draws the collision while Greg Land continues the plot that follows Havoc. Basically, my only problem with this book is that tonal quality. It feels like it should maybe be a little bit more serious, and I'm just having trouble adjusting. I know that I shouldn't, because Havoc just got axis flipped, and maybe he's just lighter-hearted now, or maybe having been a villain, he feels like he should lighten up. So I don't think that it's something that I'm having a problem with where it's like not in continuity for that character, but it's just a little bit jarring for me. Do I think it's worth reading? It's one of those things where I think we need to see the whole arc, not only because I'm trying to judge it as a whole, but because Rosenberg definitely tends to seed in small themes and develop them over the course of issues. He doesn't tend to be somebody who just delivers a lot of one-and-dones. And this issue had a very sort of middle issue syndrome where it just kind of felt like, how much is really happening here? I will say that on first read, I was a little put off by the Land to Edwards pencil switching, but on second read, it actually kind of worked for me. Edwards, even though he's a little bit more of a sketchy artist, you can see more of his pencil work, more of his line work. He actually is colored in a consistently clean way here with Land, and they don't fight against each other as much as I felt like maybe they did at first. I think the problem was that when the two crossed over, when the Reavers encountered the X-Men team again, I expected that to be Land art because it was the X-Men, and when it switched to Edwards, I kind of had this moment of, ugh. So who do I think really should read this book? Well, if you love Havoc, you probably want to be following him. As many of us know, I am a massive fan of Dazzler, and so I would be reading this book anyway because it has Dazzler in it. I don't know that it's a great feaster for Beast. I know a lot of people are excited about Banshee, and he hasn't had too much to do yet, or too much to say yet, so we've still got a lot to find out about him. To me, I think the best part in this book is actually this more philosophical dialogue that's happening between Warpath and Havoc, kind of threaded through. It starts out in this very silly, like, you're not the X-Men, cease and desist, please stop. But by the end of this issue, it gets a little bit more to the fundamentals of, like, what Havoc believes being an X-Men is, and what Warpath believes it is. And Warpath is very much about doing right. Like, he came to the X-Men, his older brother, James Proudstar, having died, you know, shortly after Giant Size X-Men. And so Warpath I really like when writers kind of dig in and play with his motivation. He is not just a mutant who joined the cause to join the cause. He's got a lot of history, and I tend to be very favorable on that character. And I like here that we're blending him with older characters, much like in the Kyle and Yost X-Force that started in 2008, because I feel like he feels so much more adult than a lot of the characters of that late New Mutants, early X-Force era. So that's where we stand in Astonishing X-Men. I'm definitely going to continue to pick it up. Look, if you don't like the idea of funny Havoc, if you don't like Greg Land's pencils, or if you haven't really been feeling the Matthew Rosenberg stuff yet, then I don't think you need to rush to pick it up. And otherwise, I'll keep you updated so we can see how the story continues to break. Next up, we have Old Man Logan Annual Number 1. Now, Marvel's been doing a lot of annuals this summer, and many of them have been chances for other writers to step in and do a one-shot story that perhaps is a bit of an audition on characters. But this is not that. This was written by Ed Brisson, and with art from Simone DeMeo, color art from Dono Sanchez Almara, letters from Corey Petit, and a cover by Shane Davis, Michelle Delecki, and Val Staples. And it is edited by Chris Robinson and X-Men Group editor Jordan White. Now, there's also a backup story in this issue. That backup story is written by Ryan Cady with art from Hayden Sherman, color art again from Dono Sanchez Almara, and letters from Corey Petit. This is not a comic book that you need a lot of background to read. It's not part of the current Old Man Logan continuity. It's actually part of the original Old Man Logan story, originally developed by Mark Millar and Stephen McNiven, where he is in the future and he's, had this confrontation with the Hulk gang, and it's after that. And it shows how he intersects with a Punisher in the future. The Punisher, really, Frank Castle, but also a Punisher gang who may or may not be operating with Frank Castle's warrant or agreement. Now, I was a little puzzled by this issue because it doesn't feel like it's a story that yearns to be told. I definitely look at comic issues, especially like one-shot issues a lot of the time, and say, was this demanding to be told? Did we need this chapter? Not does it matter, or like does it really feel like there's some continuity hook that's in it? But like, was it demanding to be told? Was it in a writer's brain and just saying, tell me, tell me, tell me? And I don't know. I mean, maybe it was in Brazan's brain. He was like, I gotta tell it. But I don't know, for me as the reader, if I really felt like, wow, I've always been missing knowing what happened to Frank Castle. I mean, they're just a bunch of old dudes, and a lot of them are kind of blind. I don't really know how much else I need to know about this Old Man Logan future, but we all know that I am a little bit of a grump when it comes to these alternate futures and timelines. I don't see a lot of value in it. I think the thing that was more jarring to me is that Old Punisher is actually kind of a thing right now because of Cosmic Ghost Rider. I don't want to, I mean, that's a little bit of a spoiler just to say, and I don't want to go into it too much more deeply, but Punisher's ultimate fate in the Marvel Universe does have something to do with Cosmic Ghost Rider, who's very, very hot right now. And I sort of, as I started reading this, had an inkling of like, oh wow, like is Brazan going to link this Old Man Logan future to the late stage future that we saw in Donny Cates' Thanos, to link this Frank Castle to ultimately what happens with Cosmic Punisher? The answer is no. So I don't know. It's like not like Punisher's having a big moment right now, although his new series just started, and it just feels like much more of a Frank Castle story than a Logan story. That said, it's actually a very attractive issue. I really, really enjoyed the artwork. And, I sometimes expect something a little bit more vicious or rough or darker toned in an Old Man Logan story, but there was a certain gloss and polish to this that didn't leave behind the sense that it was dusty and dilapidated. And I think so much as it was an art audition, I would say that that art audition was passed. Now, there's also the backup story. It's very brief, and it's just a really brief Frank Castle Punisher story set in the future. There's really not a lot to say about it. I wasn't a huge fan of the art. I didn't think that, in fact, I couldn't even really decipher what was happening some of the time. The writing was fine. So, do you need to pick up this issue? No. This is much more for Punisher fans and fans of alternate future timeline-y stuff. And also, if you just really, really like that Old Man Logan original story by Miller, and you like to read Old Man Logan in that future context and not so much in the present-day context, who knows? Maybe some aspect of this will prove to have been something that we need to know about Old Man Logan in the present day, because you have to remember, he does have all of his memories that happened in the future, so maybe he's going to recall that, and this is going to be a factor in his ongoing arc. Right now, hard to say. Next up, we have Weapon X issue number 23. Weapon X number 23 was written by Greg Pak and Fred Van Lent, with art from Yildiray Cinar, colors from Frank Dermata, letters from Joe Caramagna, and a cover by Raza. It is edited by Chris Robinson and X-Men Group editor Jordan White. This series began with the idea that some reformed version, not reformed like, oh, we're better now, but reformed version of the Weapon X program was searching for some past subjects, but also people who had really strong healing factors because they were up to no good. And that's where we started a little over a year ago in this title, and the characters that were thrown into that mix were Old Man Logan, Sabretooth, Domino, Warpath, and Lady Deathstrike. However, as this series has gone on, it's actually done a really good job of reflecting and being a little bit of a conversation with Ed Brazan's Old Man Logan, because we see an Old Man Logan on decline in this series. He started out kind of leading this team because he felt like he had to, but not because he wanted to assemble some new X-Force or anything like that. And we see that it takes its toll on him. And, the quality dipped a little bit for me, got a little tiresome in the teens, but really picked back up in the last arc, where we see Old Man Logan basically has to tap out. And so then we have, these bad characters, Sabretooth and Lady Deathstrike. We have this very opportunistic character, Domino, and then we have Warpath, who's like not really enough to put them on the straight and narrow, especially because he doesn't have a lot of ground to stand on, because he made some questionable decisions on his own in the arc that was about the about Nuke and the little pills that he pops to be a badass soldier of fortune. So Warpath now is out of the picture. This is the second issue of a 2-issue arc, and we've added to the team Omega Red. I really am into this idea of Omega Red trying to be a team player. He and Sabretooth have some really funny, but also not heartfelt, but like significant moments in the last arc where Sabretooth is like, you're just a pawn. Like the idea that you're a villain is something that somebody told you. Like, you might be evil, you might be a bad dude, but somebody gave you that label, and you could choose whatever you want to do and discard the label, because that's kind of what Sabretooth has done. So that really, really works for me. Another thing that really works for me is Pack is one of these writers, and Venlet too, but Pack very much, because he tends to write more on his own at Marvel, and Venlet tends to be a writing partner for him. Pack is a writer who loves picking up other plot threads and sewing them back in. And to me, that's what the X-Men is about, way more than alternate timelines or futures or time travel or space or any of that nonsense. The X-Men is about picking up threads and sewing them back into what's ultimately a big interwoven narrative. And the thread that Pack picks up is of Monet. Now, we saw Sabretooth and Monet in Uncanny X-Men right after Secret Wars, which was written by Cullen Bunn. And this was a team that was a little bit villainous, and Monet was there for questionable reasons, but she also kind of formed a little bit of a relationship with Sabretooth. Now, we've seen Sabretooth form a lot of questionable relationships with a lot of younger women, and they tend to be kind of ooky and also violent. But this was not entirely that, like, because he's been axis flipped, and because Monet has a little bit of uncontrolled vengeance in her too, they actually formed a much more sibling relationship that we tend to see with Sabretooth and any female characters. And so the team catches wind that Monet has kind of been held captive somewhere, but they could also make some money on it, and that's where this arc has brought us. But that somewhat smooths over the fact that Monet, after Uncanny X-Men, appeared in Generation X, written by Christina Strain, and was kind of struggling with the possession of her body by her brother Emplet, who was kind of using it to drain other mutants of their powers, and at the very end of that, they get split apart. So basically what this arc is saying, like, well, since they've been split apart, Monet has been weakened, maybe emotionally, psychically, and she kind of falls in with a bad crowd. It's a little bit of a hand wave in terms of plot development, because I'm like, really, like, super rich, super full of herself, Monet is going to fall in with this crowd, but you kind of just go with it. Now, that was a lot of talk without talking about this actual issue. I'm into it, but it has, as you can see on the cover, a special guest star, Deadpool. Pack and Van Lent do an excellent job of writing Deadpool, but it really turns into a Deadpool issue. It's just a big old Deadpool fight, and Deadpool having throwdowns with each one of these characters, many of which he has history with. So that's fun, but when you use Deadpool as a guest star, it's really easy for him to take control of your narrative and turn it into a Deadpool book. Probably because he's just fun to write for writers, right? He's got all these quips and he's super dangerous and all of this, but I think that, like, an example of Deadpool not taking over a book that we saw in the last month with it was in Mr. and Mrs. X, #2. Kelly Thompson used him very well, but he did not usurp Rogue and Gambit in that book. And here it just feels like he kind of usurps it. I wanted to see so much more of Sabretooth and Omega Red. I wanted to see more of Sabretooth and Monet. And instead we kind of just get this big Deadpool fight. I do really like the pencils here from Yildiray Snar. I will say that I get a little bit frustrated sometimes when we have a cover that's so photorealistic as this, and then the inside art is not only not penciled in that way, because there's not a lot of internal pencilers that can do that kind of thing, but also colored in a way that's just like a little bit softer and doesn't have that very reflective light source aspect of photorealistic covers. But I will say that the art is a slightly better match, not to the cover, but to the tone of the book than the last arc, which got kind of very silly and cartoonish in a way that I didn't think fit with Weapon X at all. So if you haven't been reading Weapon X, I think that you could kind of jump back in without a lot of backstory on the previous issue, which would be issue number 22, and then read to this, or you could just wait until this resolves and we can see what's next. I'm personally interested to see if this title is really going to continue once we get to Uncanny X-Men in November, because it doesn't, on one hand, it seems like a lot of the titles could end then and then get reset. On the other hand, none of these characters anymore are really X-Men, unless Monet joins the team, so, well, and Domino, sort of. So it doesn't really feel like it has to end to make room for that. But it was a fun read if you're you're a Deadpool fan and also an X-Men fan, it's going to be really pleasing for you. If Deadpool's not part of the X-Men universe to you, I don't know that you need to rush out for it. Maybe you want to start waiting for the next arc to begin. Our final X-Men book of the week this week is X-Men Gold, number 35, the penultimate issue of the series. There's only one more issue to go after this. X-Men Gold, number 35, was written by Mark Guggenheim, with art from Simone Bonfantino and Giovanni Valletta, colors from Eric Arciniega, letters from Corey Petit, and a cover by Phil Noto. It was edited by Chris Robinson, Darren Chan, and X-Men line editor Jordan White. X-Men Gold. Gosh, am I really going to recap 34 issues of this title? No. Let's just give you the most relevant part. X-Men Gold tends to follow the official X-Men team that is assembled and led by Kitty Pryde. And the anchors of this team for all of this run have very much been Kitty Pryde, Storm, and Nightcrawler. And there's been other characters who've come in and out. Iceman really became a full-time cast member after his solo title resolved. But this arc, which has been called God War, is very much centered on Storm. Storm returning to her village in Africa where she grew up to confront the idea that the villagers' belief has been vested in a new deity who's pretty evil, and he's taking advantage of that to consolidate his evil power, and kind of can Storm regain her goddessness here. I think it's interesting because, to me, I think that there was a lot of opportunity to develop Storm in this X-Men Resurrection era that began with X-Men Gold and Blue and X-Men Prime, the one-shot just before that. And the reason I say that is because Storm had been the de facto leader of the mutants for the initial part of All New, All Different. And that kind of terminates in IVX, in Humans vs. X-Men, where she does lead the X-Men, the mutant race, from the brink of calamity. But then we see in X-Men Prime, she's tired. She tells Kitty Pryde, like, I feel like I made a mistake. I erred. I don't feel like I can be in this chair anymore. And it's an interesting facet of leadership of the X-Men because we've seen a lot of X-Men leaders fall from grace. That's been a big theme for almost the last decade of X-Men, right? So we had Cyclops falling from grace in Avengers vs. X-Men, along with Emma, who's definitely his co-leader. We had Wolverine, dying at the end of Wolverine and the X-Men. We have Magneto kind of turning back to the dark side, which Cullen Bunn has been managing now through 3 different ongoing series. But each of those fates wound up being an interesting fate for the character, right? Like Cyclops gaining ultimate power and realizing he didn't know what to do with it. Wolverine kind of coming to understand his role as this generational father and coach, and then ultimately losing his healing factor and dying. Magneto getting the chance to leave the mutant race and finding out that a lot of his methods only work when he can't be the good leader. All these were really good, interesting stories, and I was hoping that we would get that end state for Storm. And it just doesn't feel like we really have. And this arc could have been that, right? Like, it seems like there's something really interesting to be said about Storm re-inhabiting her goddessness and trying to identify something within her that she's more than just a leader and more than just a symbol, and it doesn't always work for her to be a leader. She's a leader when things need to get done and need to happen, but she's not necessarily a peacetime leader. If you think back to the long history of the X-Men, the times that she's really been in charge tend to be when the X-Men are under siege to some point, and that really goes back to her taking over some Cyclops back in Uncanny X-Men 201. Instead, we get something a little bit different, which investigates her godhood in a way that I felt was very artificial because it has to do with bringing back her hammer. She has this Thor hammer from when she was briefly a Thor in Asgard, and it's been kind of coming back in during this X-Men Gold. And I feel like Guggenheim really uses it as a cheat to get past doing any kind of investigation of Storm's humanity, and not even about her worthiness for the hammer, as you might get with Thor. It's just this very MacGuffin-y thing where, like, Storm's not strong enough, but then she'll be strong enough with the hammer. And it just feels like it really gave away a chance to do something really interesting for her character. Now, she's been going it alone for a couple of issues. Ultimately, the other X-Men come back in this issue and kind of assist her. It looks fine. I think it's an okay Storm story, but it just didn't really get me anywhere. And especially because if you've been reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' Black Panther, his Black Panther has already covered this ground for Storm. His whole second meta arc of Black Panther was about the idea of godhood and about that you need believers to imbue you with strength, and that Storm in Wakanda is not the same as their traditional gods, but Storm still has the strength because of the enduring love of the people that they have for her from when she was the queen of Wakanda. That was really interesting, and Coates didn't even write too much Storm. She was very much like a side character, but that was really good, and this just seems like a really lame echo of that. So I would say if this idea of Storm is interesting to you, and this idea of gods are given the power by the people who worship them, I would actually say go and read that second Black Panther arc, which starts from Black Panther 13 and goes into the legacy numbering. It's not a lot of Storm. I don't want to promise you you're going to read a lot of Storm, but it just, for me, connected a lot more than the story. The one thing I will say is that it resolves in a nice place. We get some moments of acceptance with Storm of the African part of her identity, and I don't mean her Blackness, which she's always very much in touch with, but the part of her identity that very much stems from the fact that she was from a small village and a small community, and how she's recreated that with the X-Men, but sometimes she doesn't go back and connect to that originally, although even that felt like a little bit of a lame echo, because we've gotten some of that reconnection from her to the, more traditional roots that she has in the African continent in Black Panther, even though that's in Wakanda rather than in her home. So I don't think this is a must read, even if you're a big Storm fan. It does not end on any kind of cliffhanger or anything, so that last issue that's coming to us next month, X-Men Gold number 36, is just going to be a one-off, although who knows to what extent it's going to sew up all of the themes of this run. Before we wrap up this week, there are actually 2 new X-Men collected editions out, one of older material, one of newer material. The newer material one is a little easier to recap, so I'll do that first. It's called X-Men Red, Hate Machine, and it is the first arc of X-Men Red and the annual, and I've heard from people who've already picked it up that the annual is actually slotted first in the collection because it's actually the thing that directly follows Jean Grey's return in Phoenix Resurrection. I found the opening arc of Red a little bit hit or miss, but it's really started to resolve in the last couple of issues for me. So this is the part that's a little bit more hit or miss, but it's teeing up a really good series, and it really hinges a lot on if you like Tom Taylor's writing and also Muhammad Asrar's art, which I don't always love, but maybe you do. Now, the other collection out this week is The Wedding of Cyclops and Phoenix as an oversized hardcover. They call it an omnibus, it's not. Marvel always does this. They always say X-Men omnibus, and when the actual book comes out, it just has the word Marvel on the spine. For when there are these events and collections of kind of random groups of issues, they only tend to label them omnibus when they really can be marketed like that, like the Jim Lee and Chris Claremont omnibuses. This fills a pretty major gap, although not all of the gap that I'd want to fill. You're eventually going to see a Crushing Comics episode about this because it's absolutely going on my shelf. But the thing that you need to know right now is it fills between the 2 books Fatal Attractions hardcover, not the paperback, which doesn't have everything that the hardcover has in it, and the Phalanx Covenant. It fills that whole gap. It fills in around the 1 extra issue that was in the Fatal Attractions book, so it completely plugs that. Why am I not totally happy with it? Well, we'll get into it more when I do the full Crushing Comics video on it, but I feel like it could have included another 6-ish issues of X-Men Volume 2 from 1991 that would have picked it up from the end of Executioner's Songs. Right now they have been orphaned. That's This Week in X. I hope I've helped you figure out where you could be dipping your toe into the X-Men line if you're not reading everything, or if you're ready to be reading everything, what is going on. Now don't forget, in November we're cutting a relaunched Uncanny X-Men, and it's going to run weekly for the first 10 issues with a trade-off from 3 writers, Kelly Thompson, Ed Brisson, and Matthew Rosenberg. So it's really the time to get a little bit caught up on the X-Men, even if you're not reading everything. We don't know yet to what extent it's going to start totally from scratch or rely on a lot of the ends of these current books. So I'm going to keep up doing This Week in X for you. If you have comments, suggestions, please tell me below. I feel like on this episode I tried to go a little bit more into the thematic material and not as much in terms of this happened, I liked it, this happened, I didn't like it. Did you like that? Tell me below in the comments, and the best signal you can send to me that I should keep doing these is if you watch it, which you're doing, but also if you like and subscribe. I'm somebody who loves data, and when comparing these to other videos on my channel and other videos on other channels, the best way to tell me to keep doing This Week in X is to show me with the data that it's something that you would like to see more of and that you would like to share to other X-Men fans in your life. So thank you so much for watching. I've been your host, Peter, and this has been This Week in X, presented by Crushing Comics.